Hi, everybody in Research Methods. Section 3 of the reading packet is researching a topic, qualitative research, case studies, and naturalistic observation. So, we're going to get started here. Quantitative versus qualitative. This is something in this class that is really easy to be confused about because it's not something that we think about on a regular basis. Quantitative comes from the word quantity, adding up the numbers of something. Obviously, if you're asking people for a number score, like how many times have you been here or done this, that's a quantity, but also adding up scores. So if you're asking people yes or no, or true or false, and adding up those numbers, it's quantitative. Qualitative is much different. What you're doing in qualitative is getting the quality of someone's experience. So therefore, if you say to people, how do you feel about being here? What do you think about this experience? They can't give you a number score, a yes or no, or even a true-false answer. They have to tell you about the quality of their experience. So if you look at the second paragraph here, what is it like living with someone who is an alcoholic? Quantity, how many DUIs does that person have? How many times has that person been arrested, lost a job? You're asking for number scores, yes or no, true or false. That's not the quality of someone's experience. If you say, tell me what it's like, what does it feel like, what do you think? The person has to give you a longer answer, but it does get into the quality of their experience. So here's my question for you. Which one is easier to do? And then my second question, which one is more interesting? I would say that quantitative is usually easier because it's less things for you to type, number scores, even correlations or t-tests or whatever, quantity. But qualitative is usually more interesting. You get to know what people think and what they feel. I would not spend a lot of time trying to memorize these things right here and here. It's just a further explanation of what these things mean. For example, in quantitative, we're trying to measure real things that exist out there in the world with number scores, whereas qualitative, I want to know your mental events, what's happening in your mind and in your feelings. Quantitative assumes that if we observe and measure things, we can get number scores about them. But in qualitative, it's actively constructed. What does that mean? Well, every minute of every day, you're constructing new thoughts and feelings in your head, and I want to know what those are. Quantitative, data is constructed objectively through observation. So I want to get to the truth of what's out there, and I'm going to build my truth by gaining more information. Whereas in qualitative, it's your perspective. There is no truth. The truth is in your head, and someone else has a different truth than you do. In quantitative, I want to attempt to further explain what's out there in the real world by doing my research and adding to what's already known, whereas in qualitative, I want your experience. I want to know the way that you give meaning to your world. So, true story about my family. You don't get to know me very well in this kind of online environment compared to if we were in person together, but about 10 years ago, when the economy was really bad, I took my family to Disneyland, and, are you sitting down? We got in for free. They had a program because the economy was so bad, give a day, get a day. If you could prove that you've volunteered for 4 hours somewhere in your community, you get into Disneyland for free. They probably assumed that everybody would spend money once they got there, which for us was true. Anyway, It didn't come with no strings attached. You had to wear a pin saying give a day, get a day, and Disneyland employees would frequently come up to you and ask you questions and then put it in their tablet of what you said. Well, I thought it was interesting because they were using people who got in for free to do quantitative and qualitative work. So if we were in class together, I would ask you for some examples. So instead, let me give them to you. Quantitative. How many rides have you been on? How many times have you purchased food? What have you purchased? What about souvenirs, from stuffed animals to pins to games to balloons? I want to know the quantity. But qualitative. Tell me what this day is like for you. How much fun are you having? You can't say yes or no. I want you to describe it for me. What could make this experience better? So, you want to know a way to never get this wrong on an exam or in any other aspect of your life where you need to know the difference between quantitative and qualitative? If you're asking thinking or feeling questions, it will be qualitative. Tell me what you think. How do you feel when this happens? Those are qualitative. I'm getting to the quality of your experience. If I ask you something that could be answered, yes or no, true or false, a number score, one word, those are quantitative. I'm not getting to the quality of your experience. So, I hope that makes sense. Moving right along. Most research is quantitative. T-tests, correlations, analysis of variance, they are number scores. They are quantitative. But here are two types of research that could be quantitative or qualitative. That's why we're discussing it in these chapters right here. Well, actually, specifically chapter 3 more than other chapters, now that I think about it. Qualitative, naturalistic observation and case studies can be quite qualitative in nature. In a naturalistic observation, you might remember this discussion from Psych 101. Hopefully your instructor covered it. If it was me, I covered it, that's for sure. Naturalistic observation, observing people, or even animals sometimes, in their natural environment. So, you're a student, and if you were sitting in class, well, that would be your natural environment, wouldn't it? If I wanted to measure you somehow on campus, well, that would be your natural environment. So, it can be qualitative if I can record your voice or your reactions and somehow get to the quality of your experience. So, speaking of recording your voice and what you say and what you talk about, interval recording. It's usually video and audio. I want to see when you show up and how much time you spend there and what you do. Well, those might be quantities, but the quality is your experience, what you talk about, how you feel, and what you think. So, interval recording. Why is this an issue of naturalistic observation? Because what if I show up at the wrong time? What if I want to see, like, how much coffee you're drinking, but I show up on a hot afternoon and you're not drinking coffee and neither is anybody else? Sometimes when you show up to do your recording, it makes a difference. So you might need to go back multiple times. I had a student one time who wanted to know if people who walk by the glass wall of the library, you might have seen that on campus, if they stop to look at their own reflection. Well, the day that he sat inside the library watching people on the outside, it was raining. That didn't work out very well. So interval recording has to do with when you show up to do your observation. Observing people in their natural environment. That's the goal. Observer bias. What if you've already made up your mind that women look in the mirror more than men, or vice versa? That example I just gave you of looking at your own reflection. Well, if you're biased, even if you don't realize it, and you have your mind made up, that is a problem, isn't it? So, observer bias. That's something you have to try to watch out for and minimize. Third thing, Operational definitions. Sometimes you need to define what you're talking about. A person who is angry because of a test score, a person who is upset because they didn't get the parking spot they want. You might need to define those words before you ever even start your study. What does it mean to be upset? What does it mean to be angry? What does it mean to have a long wait to get in somewhere? In Psych 101, I show a video about marital satisfaction using newlyweds. Well, wait a minute. What's a newlywed? In the definition of the researcher, you've been married 2 years or less. But someone else might say, I thought a newlywed was 1 year, or I thought it was 6 months. It doesn't matter. As long as you have a very clear definition that no one can misunderstand, you have a good operational definition. And that helps you naturally observe people because you know exactly what you're looking for. Next thing, the observer effect. If you're trying to watch somebody in their natural environment and they notice you watching them, that's a problem. Or they notice the camera or whatever it is that gets in the way of it being a natural experience, obviously that ruins the study. I was once part of a study observing children at a preschool, and this little boy comes up to me and he goes, "What are you doing?" Gee, he was only like 3 or 4 years old, and he knew that it was not a natural environment anymore because a total stranger is there watching them. So, if it can be a hidden camera, or maybe you are there anyway because you're a classmate or you're a server at the restaurant and you blend into the natural environment, then you don't have to worry about the observer effect. The person knows they're being watched and they're going to act differently because of that. Another type of research that can be qualitative or could be quantitative, but we're talking about qualitative here, aren't we, is a case study. So let me point that out here. In a case study, you're following one person. I suppose it could be a couple or a small group, but usually one person for an extended period of time. So what does that mean? Well, you might be following them for a whole day, a whole week. It could even be months or years to get enough information, usually about that one person, where you can write up a report about what that person's life is like. Now, an interesting one I saw on the National Geographic Channel, a 5-year-old boy moving from Central Africa to Boston, Massachusetts. Can you imagine a bigger move than that when you're 5 years old? My goodness. Well, anyway, he adjusted very quickly and became a Red Sox fan, actually, and a New England Patriots fan, just like his little friends. His parents, though, it was harder for them to get used to living in Boston compared to where they came from, a world away. It was really interesting. Well, that's what case studies are. They're interesting. You really get to know that one person like a reality TV show. However, what is the limitation? Just because it happened to one person in one way does not mean that it would ever happen that way to any other person. So the advantage of a case study is the rich detail you get. Oh my goodness, I almost feel like I know this person because of how much detail is in the case study. But the limitation of a case study, even doing the best qualitative research that you can, is that you don't know that this experience would happen the same way to anybody else. There's no proof of that. Now, on the exam, there will be questions about this study. Phineas Gage. Maybe you've heard of this guy. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker, in fact a supervisor, in the mid-1800s. If you follow U.S. history, building railroads was a big deal back then. That was the only way to connect cities, because before that you had to ride on a horse or walk. There were no cars or airplanes back then. So Phineas Gage was in charge of a group of men. They were blasting through some rock, and a little problem happened. Well, actually a big problem. A railroad spike flew through the air. It was in this coupling holder, as they called it, flew through the air. He was standing over these guys, and they were kneeling, and it shot up in the air, went through his cheek, through the top of his head. This animated picture is not entirely accurate because it exited his head at such velocity that it landed 30 feet away from him, and he was flat on his back. Why do we still talk about him today? Because he lived with this huge gaping hole in his head in the mid-1800s. He survived for 12 years. Experts believe that he probably died of a slow-moving infection after that. Well, anyway, Phineas Gage became animal-like. He was able to talk, but he slowly lost that ability. He was able to control himself, and he slowly lost that ability. He really went crazy, for lack of a better word. He became mentally ill, but he survived. So what an interesting medical case study of traumatic brain injury. Some people say he was like the George Washington of traumatic brain injury, the first where it was really measured and studied. So this was definitely a case study, and we could apply those 4 terms that we just talked about with naturalistic observation as well, because his doctor, as you'll see here, Harlow, he followed him, not every day, but quite often for those 12 years, and took notes about Phineas Gage. So what did he learn? Well, that he deteriorated, he had trouble with impulse control, violent and sexual behaviors that were totally inappropriate, and he never used to act that way. The 4 things that we learned from naturalistic observation, it did matter when he studied him, because Phineas Gage got progressively worse, but also, like a lot of brain-injured people, he got worse as the day went on also, like his brain got tired and exhausted. Observer bias. Even with that brain injury, Phineas might have acted differently around the doctor than he would around other people, whether it be family or strangers. There's an observer, that's the observer effect, but maybe the doctor was biased also. Maybe he liked or disliked Phineas. Sometimes when you know the person you're observing, it's easy to be biased. And also, operational definition. That's an important term on the first page, or the previous page, I guess I should say, because if he was measuring aggressiveness in Phineas, he might want to define that. Or cognitive decline, what does that mean? He probably needs a definition for that too. So, there is a video if you're curious. Maybe you've never heard of this story, or you're not all that familiar with it. You will see a video in this section of the Canvas page that you can watch, so it will make more sense, and then you'll get the test questions right as well, because that's always the goal. So speaking of the test, it's over chapters 1, 2, and 3 of the reading packet. Yes, there are those short quizzes in between, but you want to make sure that you get the exam done in a timely manner. There is always some essay questions along with the multiple choice and matching. So that is about all you need to know for this section. Let's just do a very quick review. Section 3, quantitative versus qualitative. People do mess this up. It's so hard to get used to this kind of thinking. Quantitative is the quantity, so any number score that you're getting, or even yes, no, or true, false questions. However, qualitative is so much different, wanting to know what the person thinks or what they feel. If you are typing up your paper, imagine how much longer that is to type up people's quality of experience. They might tell you in sentences or even paragraphs about what they think or what they feel. Moving right along, naturalistic observation is something that could be done qualitatively. I want to hear what you think and what you feel. I'm going to observe you in your natural environment. Things that could be problematic, interval recording, when I show up to measure this, could matter, morning, noon, or night, weekends or weekdays, sunny weather or rainy weather, it could matter. It really could. Observer bias. Observing people in their natural environment is great, but not if I'm already biased and I have my mind made up. Operational definition. I want to be sure that I define things as clearly as possible. And the observer effect. I don't want to be noticed. Me standing there watching them, or the camera could be discovered. Case studies can also be qualitative. If I can hear what you're talking about and discussing, getting the quality of your experience. Usually you're following one person. The advantage is, wow, I got so much detail about you. But the disadvantage is, it doesn't mean it's going to happen that way to anybody else. And that's a perfect time to talk about Phineas Gage, because if he got a railroad spike through his brain and lived for 12 years, does that mean it will happen to everybody exactly the same way? And the answer is, of course not. Some people might live healthier lives than he did, but honestly, most people would die. That's just the unfortunate reality of a traumatic brain injury like that. By the way, his skull and the railroad spike are on display at the Harvard Medical School Museum to this day. That's kind of the proof of this medical tragedy that was very much worth studying in a case study sort of way. So don't forget the exams over chapters 1, 2, and 4. Take care.